Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for staying tuned to Joy News. Welcome to PM Express. Well, President John Mahama has expressed optimism that the 3-year International Monetary Fund program to take off in January 2015 would open up investment opportunities for the country. It would also deliver infrastructure development and create social intervention programs for the poor and vulnerable in the society. The country and the IMF are currently engaged in preliminary discussions over an economic resurgence program, which the president said would be expected to, yield some results by next year. But this evening here on PM Express, we're asking a crucial but relevant question, which is the IMF interventions or mediations, any prospects at all for Ghana? My name is Prince Mink, and welcome to the program. Thanks for staying with us, and remember, you can join us with your messages on our various social networking platform, and certainly we'll share them with the rest of the world. Now, let me just let you know this. He predicted that Ghana's economy was going to be in crisis some time ago, and he's not the only one who had done that. The New Patriotic Party mentioned that the economy was in crisis. They mentioned that in their press conference. Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, the running mate for Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, also mentioned the same situation. Today, Ghana is back to the IMF. We weaned ourselves off the IMF. We're back to the IMF. Any relevance at all? And exactly what results would it yield? At least that's the question on the minds of a number of Ghanaians. And I'm referring to Dr. Theophilus Richardson. He's a policy analyst and an economist, and he's our guest tonight here on PM Express. Good evening to you, Doc.
Good evening.
And welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so you made those predictions, and you're not the only one. The MPP did, and members of parliament also did. And you remember the kind of defense that was put up by government regarding the issue that the economy was in crisis, and the government kept insisting that there were challenges and that it was being dealt with. Today, we're back to the IMF. Now, do you see any prospects at all?
Thanks. My greetings to our cherished, viewers. So that, well, whether or not there are prospects, we have to look at why we've gone to the IMF and why the problems of today are unique or peculiar, from the problems of yesterday or yesteryears. Because this is not the first time Ghana has gone to the IMF. Mm. If you trace back the history of Ghana's involvement with the IMF, it goes as far back as 1966, following the overthrow of the Nkrumah regime. Indeed, even whilst Nkrumah was in power, in the light of some development in the economy, in the macroeconomy, the emergence of fiscal deficit, a bulging balance of payment deficit, and indeed, for the second time in our history, the economy was on the brink of a balance of payment crisis. The IMF and World Bank were invited to come to the country, to do a study of the state of the economy. Mm. And they made certain recommendations to the Nkrumah administration, but he rejected them and adopted his own, as it were, homegrown policies to deal with the problems of the time. Mm. As to whether or not those problems would have worked, he did not stay in power long enough. But the crisis continued, and because of the severity of the crisis, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat on the, was it 13th February 1966?
Yes.
In February 1966, yes. So after that, the NLC regime, military regime, went to the IMF, and we had a standby arrangement, IMF standby arrangement, under which they gave Ghana $2.2 million, which, enabled Ghana to implement a typical IMF style, as I've always explained, orthodox monetary stabilization program. That did not mark the end of our problems. In 1971, following a plummeting in cocoa prices, okay, and therefore some balance of payment crisis. The Buzia administration also resorted to the IMF.
So there's a long history. As far as
went to the
IMF is concerned.
Achapon came and said that please a moratorium or repudiated our debt obligations. We didn't mean that we wouldn't pay, but he rescheduled our repayment regime. Fortunately, in 1966, what happened was that there was a rescheduling of our debt repayment. That went on in 1979. The Akufu SMC2 regime also was negotiating, went to the IMF. Somehow we devalued the currency from 1 CD 15 pesos, to the dollar, from which the exchange rate had been, the parity rate had remained to 2 CD 75 pesos, in 1979. And so, the Liman government came in, and as of the time that Liman was overthrown on 31st December 1981, I think the previous day or Sunday or so, the IMF delegation had arrived in the country, to begin negotiations with the government to, prepare the way for the same kind of stabilization and I suppose structural adjustment program, because in the late 1970s, thereabout, the World Bank had engaged with many developing countries which were facing problems.
But
yes.
Doc,
so this is not new.
Right.
This is not new. What is new, however, as I will say, is this, that the Kufuor administration entered into this HIPIC arrangement with the IMF,
right.
Which is highly indebted poor countries initiative, which was basically a debt sustainability program, because we were on the brink of default, giving certain liquidity and solvency indicators. We would be unable to pay our debt. So that was the only feasible, it seemed at the time, and desirable, solution. We went in for that program, under which our debt servicing, obligations would be forgiven, and we implemented those programs. It was IMF program because it was underpinned by what we call Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility, which is a kind of IMF program which takes care of medium-term to long-term, problems.
So when did that place that? At an advantage edge?
It gave us a relief.
Right.
And as people have been saying, we were able to kind of wean ourselves from IMF, having gone through the problem and reduce our debt burden and reduce our debt servicing obligations and augmented our reserves, international reserves. We felt that we could do without the IMF. Whether or not that meant a once and for all disengagement from the IMF, I'm not sure about that, okay? Because that program, the HIPIC program by Kufuor administration, did not in itself and by itself, okay, correct the fundamental problems facing the economy. That is, the capacity, the limited capacity of the Ghanaian economy to generate foreign exchange, coupled with the small size, productive capacity, the small productive capacity of the economy, that we are able to produce only a small basket of goods and services. We are able to export only a small basket of goods and services, mostly primary products. And in this even basket of exports, the number of manufactured exports is so small that, it did not fundamentally, we did not, and as of now, we have not fundamentally, restructured our export base such that we will, on a sustainable basis, say that we can earn that amount of foreign exchange we need year on year to be able to achieve self-sufficiency in foreign exchange. We did not do that. And therefore, the vulnerability of the economy, to external shocks, especially commodity price shocks, such as oil price increases, a fall in the prices of our major exports, cocoa, gold, and those kind of things, continued. It remained with us up to today. What I can say is that for all those periods that we went to the IMF, from NLC 1966 up to Kufuor's time, well, not to Kufuor's time, up to even Rawlings' time, 1983, when we embarked upon this ERP, which was basically IMF stabilization and World Bank supported structure adjustment program. Before that, we had government, yes, we had the same problems. Bulging budget deficit, a crippling debt burden, a balance of payment crisis, malnutrition, food shortages, all those kind of things remained with us. And yet, we had a well-functioning healthcare system, although Rawlings described our hospitals as graveyards, but basic healthcare was free. People could have surgery, and we have some outpatient, department. You go to the hospital, you are taken care of, you go home. But inpatient care, you are admitted to the hospital 1 month, 2 months for free, health, medication, food for free. Secondary, elementary school more or less free. Elementary school was about 150 pesos at a time. When I finished Form 4 in 1977, I paid 3 cedis. 1 cedi 50 pesos for my fees and 1 cedi 50 pesos for the middle school living certificate examination. Secondary school boarding fee was about 44 cedis. If it went up.
But Doc, let me just back in here.
We had basic health care, environmental sanitation. We had people digging our gutters. Each and every district council in this country at the time, I don't know whether, I think the number was about 120 or thereabout, had vehicles for the removal of toilets, the pit latrine. They had a vehicle for disposing refuse. They had vehicle for this suspect latrine, the water one, So all these things went on.
But today we're going back to the IMF on the back of certain intervention government says it was going to put in place, and hence the homegrown policies.
Yes. What I mean is, what is unique, what is peculiar about this problem is that the government has spent so much, is facing budget deficit. There is repressed inflation. We have balance of payment crisis, but we don't have a properly functioning health system. Our gutters are not being dug. We have cholera. School fees is a problem. There's crisis in primary education.
So what's your point? That IMF
the point there is
going
that
to IMF is irrelevant?
No, not that. The point there is that whereas in the past, even where the economy faced crisis, the government delivered on social services. Healthcare was free. In 1982, when PNDC came to power, healthcare was free. Today, healthcare is not free.
But we have the National Health Insurance Scheme.
And yet, we do have crisis. So if government spent over and above its revenues, on what did the government spend the money? At least we must have some basic care. We have public standpipes. Water is the vital ingredient of life. We don't have water. In many places, I live in Adenta, water is a problem. So, we are spending so much, we are generating so much revenue. Our export revenues have gone up. We are exporting more, we are earning more. Government has contracted so much.
But you've heard government time without number talk about our exports. Mention that we need to add value to the materials.
The government has contracted so much loans.
So meaning
and
that
yet we don't see so much in terms of the delivery of basic public services.
I'm saying that
is a problem.
Government is aware of these issues that you're raising. You don't think so? Don't you think government is aware? And for that matter, going forward, how do you reconcile the homegrown policies that government mentioned, and even now going to Senchi Economic Forum, to adding on the IMF program in resuscitating our economy? How do you reconcile that?
The difference there is that over the years, there has been a decline and deterioration in the delivery of basic public services. Whilst our tax revenues have increased, whilst our export revenues have increased, whilst the government has contracted so much. Yes, the government is making the claim that it's building so many schools and so on and so forth. But what is the evidence? After all, what is the purpose of government? To perform its conventional roles of regulating society and providing security. Okay? And those things include the provision of basic public services. All right? There are crises in all these areas. There is cholera epidemic and all those. We didn't have that in the 1970s. When there was cholera outbreak, the government sprayed our environment. During rainy season, trees were sprayed on. So we saw the government spending. Now the government is claiming that it's spending. But we don't see visible, tangible gains. Okay? Now, about the homegrown policies.
Yes.
That amounted to an admission that we are facing crisis. As you did indicate, I did somehow predict that the economy will crash or run into crisis by June this year. Not that I wanted to be a prophet of gloom. Nobody will want that crisis because, after all, it will affect me, to affect my children. All right. But when the president said that, what he admitted, frankly, you know, and I congratulate him for that, that he summoned up the courage to tell the nations that we didn't have anything. Okay? It meant that we faced a liquidity problem. It meant that we had breached what we call the government budget constraints. Now, in most developing countries, when the government is faced with a liquidity problem, you know, that is just as bad as a solvency problem. In other words, the government doesn't have the capital. And therefore, it is unable not only to generate resources domestically, but it is unable also, you know, to generate external financing, you know, to fulfill its external obligations. Okay? And that is what precipitated the, as it were, the precipitous, you know, depreciation of the cedi over a period of time, you know, and caused so much alarm in the economy. Now, for a long time, the government wouldn't admit that the economy was facing crisis.
Also, we had issues with our power. I mean, energy, there's energy crisis as well, which adds on to the challenge that the economy faces.
Yes, but what caused the energy crisis? A number of reasons. But that is a reality. You must face it. So if you are faced with energy crisis, it was going to affect your productive capacity, okay, and your ability to produce goods, supply the market, giving demand and all that. There's going to be inflation. It's going to affect your ability to generate taxes, because if firms did not produce, you will not be able to generate the excise and the VAT, you know, all those kind of things. What did the government have to do? The government should have responded to the problem. I mean, that was the time that we should have. That was the time that we should have embarked upon a kind of stabilization problem.
Okay.
But it lived in a kind of denial for too long. And we are now entering into a kind of stabilization program. But the problem has worsened. Okay. Now, about the homegrown policies. Where are the homegrown policies? What the government was trying to say is that we didn't need to go to IMF. We have been able to put together something domestically. And that we want so-called stakeholders, you know, to buy into that so that we'll be able to implement it in order to reduce the political resistance to those programs. In one part, or in another part, what that also told us is that if we went to the IMF, it was just as likely that the IMF wouldn't or was unwilling, you know, to engage with Ghana. So that if conditions were imposed on the Ghana government, you know, so that it got the money that it needed to implement those stabilizing problems, then the IMF will be blamed by the various constituencies, you know, domestic constituencies in Ghana. So right from the start, IMF was not willing to treat with Ghana government. Now, therefore, government used that as a kind of subterfuge to ward off, you know, the criticism that it was likely to face if it went to the IMF without these homegrown policies. Now, if the government had homegrown policies to reduce the budget deficit, which meant that either the government cut down its expenditures or increase tax revenue. If we had this package, if the government had homegrown policies to deal with the balance of payment crisis, which was our inability to pay our debts, if the government had homegrown policies to deal with inflation, I suspect that what we do have now is a kind of repressed inflation. Okay, inflation is about 15%. They are quoting 15%, 17%. I suspect it's more than that.
So beyond the if, what we are faced with now is the fact that we are with the IMF. But when we come back from the break, I'll find out from you. Why should we be excited?
If we had homegrown policy to deal with this problem, including our debt, why would we still have to go to the IMF?
We're with them. We're with the IMF. The meeting ends tomorrow, and we'll find out per the communique what comes out of it. But I'll hear from you exactly what you make of it, and whether Ghanaians should be excited about our meeting with the IMF and the prospect that comes afterwards. We'll take a break. We'll be back shortly. Hello again. Thank you very much for staying with us here on PM Express on Joy News on Multi TV. And we're discussing the IMF mediations and whether it has any prospects at all for our dear country, Ghana. I have in the studios Dr. Theophilus Richardson, and he's our guest this evening. He's an economist and a policy analyst. And before we went on the break, I mentioned that we're going to look at the fact that, I mean, beyond the history that you laid bare, as far as our relations with the IMF is concerned, we're here, we're back again, we're going to the IMF. But let me just let you into what President John Dramani Mahama has been saying. He's very optimistic about our deal with the IMF, and he mentions that a 3-year international program which takes off in January 2015, would open up investment opportunities for the country. He also goes on to say that it would also deliver infrastructure development and create social intervention programs for the poor and vulnerable in the society. So it looks like there's this huge expectation. It looks as though government is putting a lot of, well, if you will, all its egg in that basket called the IMF. But really, the basic question to ask is, what does an IMF program really entail? What does it entail?
Yes. As I did indicate before we went on break, if the government had homegrown policies, all these things to deal with the problem, right, why go to the IMF? We were on the brink of default, that we are going to default, that is, fail to pay our debts and interest, payment on our debts. And if that happened, then Ghana will be considered as not credit worthy. And therefore, our foreign assets could be, I would say, seized in quotes, under international payment systems, financial payment systems. There was a way of ensuring that whatever we earn from our export will be used to settle our debt, until some threshold is reached before we begin to, benefit from our export revenues. It is this, default, threat of default, that has forced us to go to the IMF. So the problem doesn't lie so much with our domestic government budget balance deficit,
right,
as with the balance of payments, deficit or crisis. This is what has forced us to go to the IMF. And going to the IMF means that we were not able to deal with our individual creditors, okay? And therefore, our problem has been forced into the international arena. What this means is that, one, we will come under the severe, stringent conditionalities of the IMF to implement a certain set of policies, to get us out of this problem before payments are made. Of course, depending on certain, how we are able to negotiate, certain monies will be can be released to us, in order to, prevent the continued deterioration of the problem. But we must understand that whether or not we had homegrown policies, we've gone to the IMF, and therefore the homegrown policies do not matter.
But I've heard government officials mention that the IMF could possibly consider some of these homegrown policies of ours,
which have to do with the market determination, right, of certain commodities, the removal of subsidies. These are all contentious issues, as we have heard time and again. For example, if we take the case of petroleum, how could we have government claim that it is subsidizing petroleum products, while we do have taxes on these petroleum products? So people have called for transparency in the structure of petroleum prices, right, and all those kind of things. But be that as it may, basically, if you go to the IMF, the IMF stabilization involves two things. One, it requires that you restore the budget balance, by reducing the budget deficit, okay, and you also reduce your balance of payments deficit, and you reduce inflation to minimum. These are the three conditions you'll be, faced with, and therefore you will be asked to embark upon a disinflationary fiscal and monetary policies. So what basically that means government has to do is to cut its expenditure or reduce its expenditure to manageable levels or increase taxes, all right, in order to deal with the balance of payment deficit. Then the government will be asked to what? To embark upon real devaluations of the currency. Now, the currency has been depreciating over the years. Now that the government is claiming that the city is making some gains and that it's been appreciating, I'm wondering, I suspect what is happening is that there has been a deceleration in the depreciation of the city. That may be a gain. But what we are interested in is to find out whether indeed there has been real devaluations of the city so that your exports become cheaper. That is what theory says. On the basis of theory, your exports become cheaper, you export more and earn more foreign exchange. At the same time as your imports become more expensive, okay, compared to goods that are produced domestically for the domestic market, so that the amount of goods you and the value of goods you import will reduce, and so you reduce the imbalances or the deficit in your your balance of payment. At the same time, the government will also be asked to reduce the level of economic activity. In other words, the amount of resources that it consumes. Okay.
So these conditionalities are bad. No, you mean?
These are the policies the government will be asked, to embark upon.
And now, these are conditions that won't help us.
If you
is that your point?
No, if you adopt a disinflationary fiscal and monetary policy.
No, I'm asking if these conditionalities will help us.
Temporarily at least. That is necessary to reduce the deficit and bring down inflation. Why? Because one way to reduce a deficit is to keep inflation at a minimum. So you want to reduce inflation because inflation is not good for the economy. Because inflation can pass through into exchange rate depreciation. Okay? So that may be good for the economy. But the flip side of the coin is that can also induce recession. In other words, it can lead to a fall in the amount of goods and services we produce, and it can even worsen the already existing precarious unemployment situation, because
and so matters are going to get worse.
It could get worse.
It can get worse.
Yeah, it can get worse. For now,
but can it be prevented?
For now,
we're already there. We're in talks with them.
If you take the tax side,
yes,
the taxation side, domestic indirect taxes are already high. The VAT is about 17.5%. Yes. What I suspect the government will want to do is to increase it to about 20% or 22%, as it has claimed is the VAT rate in some African countries. And that means that prices will go up. So that may be counterproductive. It may adversely or negatively impact on efforts to reduce inflation. Okay? And increase the cost of living, worsen the plight of Ghanaians as always. So this is one aspect that we have to be very careful about. What it means is that our capacity to embark upon what we call the economic adjustment is very limited. Okay, so the government must be very careful in how it negotiates.
How careful can government be? What should be government's posturing in this meeting with the IMF?
What the government can do is that it can reduce its expenditure, or even keeping expenditures at their current levels. It can reallocate resources.
Are you saying these conditionalities are not avoidable? Is that what you're saying?
These conditionalities are not avoidable.
We are going to face them.
We are going to face the conditionalities. The IMF will insist that the government cut down its expenditure or reallocate, restructure its expenditure. In other words, there can be what we call expenditure, expenditure switching. One thing is expenditure reduction, reduce your expenditure. But at the same time, the IMF will say that government also restructure or switch some expenditure. Even within, if you take health, it will say that look at the amount of money you spend on health administration and then increase that on health, infrastructure or on education. Spend more on infrastructure, less on administration. All those kind of things. If you look at the government sector, the public sector is buying too many cars. The number of cars that were given, for example, to the chiefs, it is not the cost of the cars purchased that matter. It is what? The running cost of the vehicles. That will impact on our budget. So these are the things that we can do.
When you hear government say, look, with our deal with the IMF, the 3-year program, we're going to see prospects. I mean, positive prospects in the area of infrastructure and industrial development and all that. What does it say? I mean, how do we reconcile it with a bleak picture that you're painting of Ghana's economic future?
No, I'm not painting any bleak future. There are two things. You have to reduce your budget deficit. They will ask you either you reduce your expenditure or increase taxes, or you do both. If the government increases taxes are already high, it will impact on the cost of living. Okay? And therefore living standards. And that could even affect the ability of firms to sell, and therefore the government's ability to even realize those indirect taxes, VAT, for example. So I'm saying that we should be careful how we go down those roads.
But are we going to see some level of growth?
The government, that depends on how resources are allocated, and that is the longer term measure. The IMF stabilization program, it's a short-term, temporary measure. Okay, it is meant to temporarily give us some relief. In addition to that, we need to embark upon longer-term structural reforms. We have done most of them already in the past. The city, has been depreciating. So, as Fifi Kweti and others claimed, that will be good for our exports. The crunch of the matter is this: that the government must look at its domestic expenditure patterns and see how best it can reallocate. Even if it wants to maintain expenditure at these levels or cut expenditure, there's too much waste. Look at the amount of money that was spent, for example, on the Shraj boss rent, $203,500. That is unacceptable. Look at the number of cars that government departments use. That is unacceptable. Look at the salaries of ministers and the president. Look at the ministers, parliament, the judiciary, and all that. If we take even these people, in fact, MPP called for a biometric audit of salaries and all that. These are things we can do in order to inject some sanity and transparency in all this. I don't see any reason why a minister must be given 45 gallons a week, a deputy minister 35 gallons a week. I don't see why we should have how many ministers? Is it 100 ministers? And how we structure our policies. The president is saying that we can have infrastructure and all these things. Look, if you go to IMF, one thing, lest I forget, we shouldn't forget is that it will also increase our debt burden anyway. The debt burden is going to increase. Now, the government has contracted $1 billion, private commercial loan, the Eurobond. That is going to increase our debt burden anyway. And from the moment that we receive the money, we will start paying the interest on the loan. Not the capital amortization. That is, I think it's about 10 years. I'm not sure about that. Either you pay it one shot or you enter into some arrangement. But the interest payment, that takes a lot of money.
So in effect, what you're saying is
at the same time, we're also borrowing 1.7 billion syndicated to buy cocoa. Let's assume that we buy the cocoa, we'll be able to earn the revenue to pay.
Right.
But all these events, ultimately increase our debt burden. If you go to IMF, what it means is that they are going to give you relief, they are going to cover your debts, give you the money, but ultimately you have to pay the money to them. Not for free, at some interest. Okay? How it will benefit the country is that these short-term loans are restructured into medium-term to long-term loans. That will give us some relief.
So then how do we cope with the situation? How can government manage this? I mean, you said our debts is going to increase.
Yes.
It's happened before, and hence HIPIC. So how should government manage the situation?
How the government should manage?
Creating that balance in the wake of the promises that's been given, that look, we're going to see massive infrastructure growth and all that. How do we balance it and see that, look, even though we're going to be indebted and all that, yet the positive aspects are there, which can cause some smiles on our faces?
There has been an increase, a substantial increase in our debt stock. So the government must cut down on borrowing. In fact, it does not make any sense.
So now that we're with IMF, we shouldn't borrow any longer?
No, we must cut down on borrowing, especially borrowing, externally to finance the budget deficit. Domestic budget deficit.
Okay.
It does not make sense. It worsens your external indebtedness, At the same time that you have not been able to enhance your capacity to generate foreign exchange.
So cut down borrowing.
So cut down
what
borrowing.
Else?
Cut down, if government should borrow, it should borrow for long-term investment, productive investment, investment that will repay the loan.
Into areas like what?
Well, if the government is borrowing to build roads into areas where we have the production of our export commodities, in the western region, in central region, those areas where we have production of cocoa and those things, it makes sense. If the government borrows to build a gold refinery, it makes sense. If the government borrows to, build our bauxite industry, it makes sense. Even cocoa, it makes sense. It does not make sense for the government to borrow to finance the budget deficit, which can be financed through all kinds of domestic arrangement. The government must also look at its consumption. There is too much, that the tendency to consume is just too much. That's one of the problems of African countries. We consume too much, we don't invest compared to our East Asian countries. So we must direct more of our resources into investment. And by investment, I mean productive investment. Look, if the government built 200 secondary school, high schools, as it's saying, that will not transform the basic structure of our economy. And therefore, the capacity of the economy to produce and employ more people. That wouldn't happen.
Okay.
So we must look at industrialization. That has been said time and again. The question is not whether or not we should industrialize. The question is how we industrialize.
And that's what I'm going to find out from you shortly. And also, we would also want to know from you, I mean, you can do your own projection in the next 5 years or 10 years, how would Ghana's economy really look like? Already you said that we're going to be highly indebted, I mean, owing to the fact that we've gone to the IMF. Is it that bad, Doc? We'll be back shortly. Stay with us. Hello again. Welcome back to PM Express here on Joy News on Multi TV. Now, I'm still here in the studios with Dr. Theophilus Richardson. He is an economist and a policy analyst, and we're discussing the IMF and of course, are going to the IMF. What are the prospects? That's the question we're asking. Now, Doc, let's move on our discussion. And this time around, I just would want to look at, in the long or short term, exactly what should be the expectations.
Okay. Now, whatever expectations we should have for the short term, let alone talk about long term, we must address the problem of corruption. What you mean? The High Court or whatever says that you should pay the money. What has happened to it? All right? And those little SADA and those kind of things, these amount, the way you amount could have built just one side of the N1, just one side, the 3-lane, and that is a road for So corruption is endemic. It is eating away our resources. What is happening at Strat, it's a quintessential case of corruption. How deep corruption is. We can even say that the corruption at all levels, and that corruption is feeding into how we price government projects. So we are inflating government projects that increase government expenditure, and that worsens the fiscal deficit, government balance deficit. There's an argument whether the government budget deficit causes the balance of payment deficit or vice versa. I think that it seems empirically that when we are spending more, then there is the temptation or tendency to borrow externally, to finance our domestic expenditure. So we must look at corruption. Now, we need to look at fiscal credibility. And the government must stop making promises between now and the elections that I will do this, I will do that, No, government must stop that. I think there are so many projects on the table already to be implemented. He doesn't need to make any new promises. It is this that will, as it were, I would say, induce the policy credibility, which is what means that government says that I will do this tomorrow, and the markets and agents will trust, will believe in the government, and they will come on board. That will inject some confidence in the economy. Then finally, I don't think it's good for us to do tax increases. We must be very careful about that. Otherwise, the economy, will not recover as quickly as we want. As for legal framework to ensure fiscal discipline, what I'm advocating is that, we need fiscal responsibility. Fiscal policy is the prerogative of every sovereign government. Government has got the right to spend.
But how do you ensure that
government,
fiscal responsibility?
Government must do, not fiscal and monetary discipline.
Right.
Government must spend responsibly. No taxation without representation.
How do you ensure that?
We can ensure that by the parliamentarians doing their politics well. What is happening now is that it is the politics.
But don't you need a legal framework?
For example, if I were the minister and I reached that legal framework, for example, I've been given some ratio that I must not breach this budget deficit, whatever, and I breach it. Would I be arrested as the Minister of Finance and prosecuted? No, we must look at the practicality of those things, of these things. Okay. After all, the exchange rate policy framework is also a big problem. Okay, and we should not think that a flexible exchange rate in itself, insulate the economy from inflation. The experience empirically, it has been shown that that does not work, and governments have time to time intervened in the foreign exchange market. So we have to look at the whole policy framework, over a period of time. All right. Now, having said all this, our expectations, if we went to the IMF and we were able to implement the policies accordingly, it will give us a short-term, at the risk of sounding tautological, temporary reliefs. Temporary. In other words, whatever reliefs, whatever gains will be transient. As for what we call longer-term advances, they have always been elusive. Longer-term advances have always been elusive, and they have depended on structural reforms.
So there are no longer-term prospects at all?
Well, in the longer term, we need to look at transforming the basic structure of the economy. We have not done that.
That should be the sole prerogative of
the president
government.
Is talking about the government.
Is that what you're saying?
President is talking about infrastructure.
Yes.
What the president must do is reorder its priorities.
Infrastructure based on the IMF program.
I don't think the IMF will be happy that the president is constructing an airport in Tamale, international airport in Tamale. First, we have not been able to optimize on the capacity of the Kotoka airport. How many people fly from Tamale and to Tamale, each day? We need the roads in the western region to be sorted out. We need the roads in the central region that go into the cocoa producing areas to be sorted out. We need to build infrastructure. If you want to produce gold, we must develop a proper policy framework to produce gold. Not this galamsey nonsense which is devastating our environment. And I think that the government has not got its priorities right. If the government built how many secondary schools? 200 or whatever. Would that transform the country? That even not consensus, national consensus on whether we should have free education and how many secondary schools we need to build in the 4 years. So it is short-term political gains which is driving the economy. And that is a recipe for disaster. So yes, the president has expectation that infrastructure, what does he say? We have expectation for infrastructure, investment in infrastructure.
Massive development.
Massive development or what? If we build infrastructure, if we build schools, they are cost-centered. They swallow resources.
Construct roads.
If we construct roads
to the various villages and towns,
only those
which are farms,
only those roads which are linked to the productive sectors of the economy, where we produce food, cocoa, and our exports, that will induce or bring in, what we call the crowding in effect. Now that it will remove the transportation bottlenecks. Farmers will be able to transport their goods to the market centers.
So there's a positive side.
That will be a positive side.
Right.
But now the president is constructing what? An international airport in Tamale. That is a misplacement of priorities. I'm sorry. So we must look at these things. If we want to build health centers, we must build proper health centers, not the cheap compounds. If you have been watching TV3 programs on rural whatever economy, only the weekend they showed some cheap compounds.
Right.
They were eyesores.
Okay, let's look at. We don't have much time. Let's quickly look at investor confidence in the Ghanaian economy. I mean, based on this IMF program, are we going to see that confidence repose in our economy, both internally and externally?
What is confidence? What the investors look out for is what we call the policy credibility. That the government promises to do something and it does it. So they're going to look at how the government, reins in some responsibility, in its expenditure. And not just expenditure amount, but expenditure patterns. They are going to look at how the government borrows and how government spends the money. They are going to look at corruption. Okay, all these Woyome case, the SADA and JIDA thing, knock the confidence that investors had in the company. Even our donors are not giving us as much money, not because anybody has preached doom, but because of how the government, has through corruption misused our monies. So that investor confidence will not come overnight. If over how many years? Usually IMF programs are between 2 years, 1 year, 3 years.
3 years, yes.
If by the end of the from January, we implement the policies and we implemented them well, and that we are back on track. There's fiscal responsibility, there's monetary responsibility. The central bank is not financing government debt, irresponsibly. We are doing the right things. Then investors may want to come, but investors will come in.
And what about industries? Industries. I mean, you've set that up for investors.
All the investors that have come in have gone into the extractive industries.
Right.
Extractive industry, that is mining. Because that's where they can make quick returns. And then these communication industries.
Okay.
How many investors have gone into manufacturing? And that is where the government needs to build bridges with our domestic investors. Without, this being, fueled or guided by party consideration, partisan consideration. If I take you back in 1993, June 4th celebration at the airport.
We don't have much time for that.
Rollins said that some domestic finance entrepreneurs, people must not buy their goods, and whatever,
right,
because they use their money to finance their parties. That was wrong. We do not expect our investors or entrepreneurs to openly.
Okay, we're 30 seconds to go.
Yeah, form parties.
Yes.
But we should expect the state to build bridges with our entrepreneurs to go into manufacturing, because after all, we all die and go.
Okay.
The politics,
we've got
it's the
30
politics
seconds.
which is destroying Ghana.
Right.
Right.
And you're saying it must stop. But 30 seconds. For anyone who will be waiting to hear from government, as far as the communique that's going to be issued on the IMF is concerned, tomorrow, what should we expect? Should we be waiting to smile that at least the economy is going to get better?
Well, tomorrow,
in 30 seconds.
Yeah, tomorrow, what we don't want to hear is that VAT is going to go up. We don't want any more tax increases, because increases of domestic tax, especially indirect taxes, kill the economy, kill the domestic economy. All right.
So should we be hopeful? Yes or no?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems that the temptation for the government to hike taxes, because the government has already made references to VAT in some countries in the sub-region, 20%, 22%. That's not good for the economy. But tomorrow, if the government tells us that we are taking the money from Woyome, we are dealing with corruption in a very tangible, manifest way.
Then we can be hopeful.
We are reprioritizing. I've stopped the airport in Tamale. It's not necessary. I'm investing the money in growth in Western region. We are doing reforestation.
Okay.
And I'm meeting entrepreneurs to invest in manufacturing. We have to
go now.
We can stop import. We are importing too much.
Very well.
And we are doing all these things to curtail imports.
Okay,
that would be a good story for Ghana.
Thanks a lot, Doc. And this discussion obviously will go on. And of course, expect a lot more angles here on our news programming and current affairs programming here on Joy News. But that'll be it for PM Express tonight with me, Prince Minka. Good night.